Hello there. Last time we spoke, when was that? About an hour ago? 2 days ago? A week ago? It depends, doesn't it? Anyway, last time we were here, we finished here, we're in the middle of this, looking at France and England, respectively, as the two models for successful centralization of nation states. But they both did it sort of in slightly different ways, or very different ways. One, France under royal absolutism, which meant that absolute power, or something as close to it as realistically possible, resided in the power and decision-making power of the king. In England, which tried to, its leaders, its kings, tried for absolute power but failed. By the end of the 17th century, ended up with a constitutional monarchy instead, which meant that the king shared power with an elected legislature, the parliament in England, and also with a constitution, hence constitutional monarchy. So both models can be seen as sort of examples or models for governments that came after them to centralize in one form or the other. There are plenty of absolute monarchies following this, plenty of, at least in the future, constitutional monarchies, sometimes one turning into another. Didn't get to this. I ask, how did the two work out in practice? First, we must keep in mind, as I said moments ago, that the English and French kings both were trying to establish absolutism. In France, they succeeded. In England, they didn't. Though the English people and England as a country going forward was much better off for the Stuart kings, as they're known. That was their last name, the kings during the 17th century, for them having failed to do so. Why did the French kings succeed in establishing absolute monarchy or royal absolutism, and their English counterparts across the Channel fail? There's two main reasons. You can see them in sort of the last bullet points for France and England. We'll start there. In and I'm keeping it simple, but in France there was effective leadership, uh, both kings and other leaders, and there were fewer institutional barriers. Not zero, but fewer. Meaning there weren't institutions so much in the way for kings to be blocked, to face obstacles to absolute power. In England, quite different on both scores. Ineffective leadership. The Stuart kings were not as good a leaders as their French counterparts. That might be putting it mildly, as we'll see. And there were big institutional barriers to kings, the monarchy, the government establishing itself as sacrosanct and sort of the absolute power. And of course, Parliament, both an elected House of Parliament, House of Commons, and a hereditary one, the House of Lords. So the English constitutional monarchy that was formed out of conflict between the kings, the Stuart kings, and Parliament in this century, leading to two civil wars, eventually ended up with the Parliament getting a share of the power, or holding on to a share of the power, advancing its own power, both the House of Commons and House of Lords vis-a-vis the monarchy and the king or kings. In France, certainly the successful uh, cementing of absolutism brought stability and was successful in the short term, but in the long term, it's open to great question. Why I put a question mark there. Long term instability, and it's not entirely clear, but since you may already know, if not, you're going to learn soon enough, by the end of the next century, 1789 to be exact, France will face the giant, rebellion or revolution of its day, or of Europe's day. That the French Revolution will be kind of the granddaddy, grandfather of all European revolutions that followed in its wake and footsteps. And many historians look back to the age of absolutism, Louis XIV, the era we're studying right now, as sort of setting the table for the French Revolution, meaning that it's quite possible that the successful absolutism actually caused long-term instability for the country, helping to lead to the French Revolution in 1789. Along with this, there was sort of always a problem of inefficiency and corruption in government. The corrupt part of it was kind of true everywhere, so it wasn't really out of keeping. But we'll see that England was much more efficient, and the inefficiency of French finance, particularly tax collection, credit, was a very serious long-term hindrance to, absolutism maintaining itself over the long haul. In England, the balance of a constitutional monarchy served that country much better. There was short-term instability in the 17th century because the kings weren't wild about sharing power with Parliament, and eventually they duked it out on the battlefield. We'll talk about that as well. But after England's sort of time of troubles here in the 17th century, it worked its problems out and came out the other side by 1750 at the latest, perhaps before, as the most stable and effective, efficient government in all of Europe, and went on to become, partly because of that stable political foundation, the richest and most powerful country in all of Europe going forward. So England comes out the other side of the 17th century in great position. France is still extremely powerful by the end of the 17th century, but its house wasn't put sort of nearly in order as was England's. So we're going to start in France and look at the course of development of absolute power being secured by the monarchy, and then we'll come back across the channel, go back across the channel to England, and look at developments there at the same time. So this means that just because we're covering all the events in France first, and then going over to England and looking at events there in the 17th century, don't be fooled into thinking that because I said it first, it happened first. So we're looking at France first. We could easily look at England first and reverse them. And just remember that both of these series of events in France and England, respectively, are happening at the same time. I mean, roughly speaking, in the same century. We're going to spend most of our time here in France looking at the reign of Louis XIV, Le Roi Soleil, the Sun King, as he basically, well, he didn't refer to himself that way, but he saw the sun and used the sun as his symbol of power. It's all over the Palace of Versailles, which you see in the photograph in the background. It's part of the inside of Versailles. And so he was already doing kind of modern propaganda. One sign of many that this guy was an astute, gifted leader and ruler, recognizing that it's important to have successful propaganda, using the sun as your symbol. Certainly, right? If you can pull that off successfully, it makes sense to do so. Right? The sun is vibrant and radiant and powerful. It's the kind of symbol a king would want. So he sort of, but because of that, because he already used it as propaganda, he later became known as the Sun King as a nickname. So we'll look at the magnificent reign of Louis XIV, a very recent biography of Louis, an excellent one. In fact, I've been looking for a good biography. I've read a couple, but they're dated, outdated, and not quite what I wanted. But this was what I've been waiting for, actually, for years. It's an excellent book. I finished it about several months ago. It just came out this last year. The author says, Louis was a man in pursuit of glory, a king devoted to dynastic aggrandizement, meaning that his family dynasty, was bent on becoming more powerful, acquiring more land, and a leader bent on national expansion, expanding the borders of France, as well as expanding the family's power and reach. He dominated his age, and since he chose the sun as a symbol, later became known as the Sun King. I guess I already gave that away. Did he deserve the name? Did he leave France stronger or weaker? And I won't answer those questions now, but they kind of are a nice jumping off point for us to understand Louis's sort of role in making France an absolute monarchy. But we're going to go back a little bit first, because he wasn't the first. Louis XIV was not the first leader or king in France to move in the direction of centralization of power under kind of the absolute monarchy framework. Even before this guy we see on the screen here came one of the most popular kings in French history, Henry IV, right around the end of the previous century, who started many of the processes we'll talk about here, that put sort of some of the foundations for centralization, again, under absolutist methods into play. Followed by Cardinal Richelieu, an extremely famous and unbelievably gifted leader. When I said that the French leaders were much better at their jobs than their English king counterparts, this guy is certainly one reason. Louis XIV, another. These leaders were extremely bright and conscientious, and just all around gifted. Richelieu came from a high-ranking noble family in France, and he was, at least in time, before he came to power as the de facto ruler of France, a cardinal in the Catholic Church, hence the name and the red cardinal's garb you see there. So he ruled over France for about 17 years, at the same time that he was a cardinal in the Catholic Church, which meant he was extremely powerful on two different and overlapping fronts. But this guy's not a king. The king that he worked for was Louis XIV's father and predecessor, Louis XIII. Yes, the numbers can get confusing in European history. All the number means, by the way, is that that person was the 13th or 14th, or whatever number it is, person with that name to be king of that country. So Henry VIII in England, right? He just happened to be the 8th person with the first name of Henry to be king of England. So Louis XIV, or Louis XIII, and then 14th, shows us that I guess Louis was a pretty popular name, at least amongst the rich and powerful royal families, because these are the 13th and 14th guys respectively with those names. It doesn't necessarily mean it's father and son from one number to the next, though in this case, Louis XIII and 14th, that's true, but not always. Sometimes it might skip a generation and it's a grandson that becomes the next number in line. But so how did Cardinal Richelieu become, as I said, the ruler of France when he worked for a king, the predecessor of Louis XIV, Louis XIII? Well, part of the reason is that Louis XIII became king when he was a little kid, and kids can't run countries. So what the tradition in those days, really throughout Europe, was to have the royal family, usually the young king, the new king's mother, sort of decide on a temporary leader known as the regent, that was brought on to run the country and usually to tutor the young king in statecraft and policy making, so that they would have some ability to do the job by the time they came of age. So that was the reason that somebody else ruled France, at least at first. But when Louis XIII did come of age and was old enough to rule, he actually decided that he didn't really want to, mainly because this guy on our screen, Richelieu, was so talented that he just said, you know what, he's doing such a great job running France. I'll just let him keep doing it. Kings have opportunities to do all kinds of other things besides govern if they don't want to, and this still meant that Louis XIII had to be involved in everything. All decisions had to be run through him, or at least indirectly with his assent. He could have fired Richelieu at any point, but the fact that he didn't, Richelieu died a peaceful death of natural causes, so he stayed in power all of that time, mainly because Louis XIII trusted him and realized this guy's a genius. I'm not letting him go. So this is how Cardinal Richelieu is one of the major contributors to the cementing of absolute power in France. He was a ruthless political manipulator. So what he did was not always pretty. We would call it immoral today, or at the very least amoral. And he was okay with the sort of at least the amoral tag. It would have been. He said in one line that I love, "If you give me 6 lines, meaning written, sentences, by the most honest of men, I will find something in them which will hang him." He's bragging there, but he was certainly right. What does that sentence mean if we translate it here from English to English? It means I'm so good at what I do. I'm so damn smart and I have so much power that you can take. I can pick up a piece of writing with 6 sentences from anyone, no matter what the subject matter, and find a way to argue like a lawyer, though he wasn't, like a lawyer, that this person is a traitor, that they've committed treason by writing this. Right? I mean, it could be somebody could be writing a note to their significant other to not forget to bring home eggs and bread and milk, and he's saying I could take that and I'd find something in it that could get them executed for treason. That's how good I am at politics, and it's an interesting way to make the point, but it also shows us what this guy was capable of, again, which wasn't necessarily pretty. So among the major goals, and in this case, overall achieved, that at least are in the realm of the drive to centralize power under absolute auspices, uh, he understood one of our basic principles of centralization of power. You have to find a way to make the nobility acquiesce. And his way of doing it was to just bulldoze them, almost literally. He had castles razed, which means burned or destroyed, torn down by nobles in certain parts of France. He also leaned heavily on the nobles' most powerful institution, the Parlement of France, as you see there on the screen. Unfortunately, the word right is the Frenchified version, pardon my French, of parliament, an English word, and so it's easy to see them as the same two things, just in different languages. But where Parliament in England, as we'll see, was a legislative body and institution, the Parlement, and there were multiple ones, hence the pluralization of that, was a judicial body. It had some administrative functions as well, but it wasn't an elected legislature. It wasn't a legislature at all. But the Parlement, as Richelieu well knew, and that's why he went after them, were the stronghold, the institutional stronghold of the nobility. Right? It was there that their power was concentrated. They were powerful anyway without that in their own districts or regions of France. But this is where their power was kind of distilled and concentrated, and so he went after them. Not in that case, not violently, because the Parlement did have legal authority, but he was able to challenge them in clever ways there, and by raising their castles in violent ways, sort of in their home locale. He used more and more intendants, as they were known. Henry IV had, I believe, begun the practice, and Louis XIV, we'll see, continues it and enhances it, increases it. Intendants is kind of a word for governor, a French word for governor, and they were sent out to basically make the decisions henceforth in each region of France, bringing royal power to cities and towns all over France. And this wasn't taken well by most of the local nobility, because, like the local Duke of, say, Normandy, duchy or province of France, he was used to calling the shots in Normandy himself. The Duke was the guy that, and now he's got some governor who's not even from Normandy, who's been appointed by the king and given the legal authority to make the decisions, and can tell the Duke to sort of step aside. I'm calling the shots here now. So this was a bold move by the monarchy, and one that did sort of face some pushback, but in the end they were able to pull it off, partly because Richelieu, Louis XIV, other leaders, sort of subordinates to them, not only were talented, but they had sort of an iron will. They were, extremely assertive, strong personalities, and tough. Sort of, they were tough to defeat, you know, politically or any other way. Richelieu also worked to centralize the economy in France under mercantilist policy. All of the European countries really practiced mercantilism, an economic theory or type of economic policy overall that had the government intimately involved in economic decision making. It sounds like we're talking about socialism, but it's not, because private businesses and private corporations already existed and were allowed to wheel and deal and trade, and make lots of money, keep the profits, not redistribute the profits. But nonetheless, the policy was, made by the French government to kind of make sure that the economy was working for and not against the government. Once that was done, the merchants can then go their separate ways and make as much profit as they like. Though, of course, it was taxed as well. Richelieu also worked at checking Habsburg power in Europe. The Austrian Habsburgs and the other branches of the family that eventually, at times, ruled in Spain and the Netherlands, other places, kind of like made it seem like Spain was surrounding France. In some ways, it was. Habsburgs were surrounding France. The Austrians surrounding France. Richelieu understood that the Habsburgs, the Austrian Habsburgs, were France's major rival for a reason. They were extremely powerful, and so he understood, I think correctly, that if we're going to, have to use our foreign policy to expand our own interests, it's going to have to be at the expense of the Habsburg interests. In the 30 Years' War, already talked about in this unit, France played a limited role, mainly by sending financial assistance to other countries. And their financial kind of bankrolling of the Protestant side in the war incited Sweden, who became one of the main combatants, to intervene at all. So France kind of held out the checkbook and said, "Here, you get into the war. We'll pay for this." What's amazing about it is that France was a Catholic country, and of all the many combatants in the 30 Years' War, almost all of Europe was involved at one time or another. France was the only country that didn't fight on the Catholic side or the Protestant side, meaning, excluding France, everybody else fought on one side or the other based on whether they were Catholic or Protestant. So the war was Catholic versus Protestant entirely, except for France. They were a Catholic country that fought or sent money to support the Protestant side. Why? Because, and Richelieu is a cardinal in the Catholic Church. There's his painting, his visage right there. He's a Catholic cardinal, and he's taking the side in a war of all the Protestant countries against all the Catholic countries, except his own? Yes. Why? Because though he was a cardinal, again, this guy understood power, and he realized that my job as titular ruler of France, or de facto ruler of France, is not religion. That's another job I have. But my job is to pursue what's in the best interest of France. And he saw the Habsburgs as the primary rival ongoing, and the Habsburgs were Catholics. So he's saying this war isn't, for us anyway, isn't so much about religion. It's about power in Europe. And if we're to have power, we have to limit Habsburg power. So we're going into the war, at least financially, on the side of the Protestants who are fighting against the Habsburg Catholics and their Catholic allies. So this guy was practicing power politics, what he called raison d'état, reason of state, which, translated still doesn't, explain what it means. But it really means that decisions are made not based on morality or religious principles. They're based on sort of realism, practical principles, what in modern times is sometimes called hardball politics. It's hard knocks because it's not based on, hey, we made an agreement with you and it's the right thing to do, and it's what God intended. Plenty of leaders in Europe had always thought of politics in those other ways, and still did to some degree. Not this guy. He was already taking a page out of some modern political leaders and parties in various countries' playbooks by saying, no, no, no. It's all about what our economic, political, military, power interests are, not about any other things. That's why his policy is amoral. So morality is sort of thrown out the window. That doesn't mean to say that he didn't have any sense of morality, though that's been questioned a lot by historians personally. But he's saying that's not my job as leader of France. Many did and do disagree. But then why would this guy be a cardinal in the first place? How could the hell could he be a cardinal in the Catholic Church and pursue policy goals as political leader of France that threw kind of morality out the window? It's a good question, but I think one thing to keep in mind here is that in Europe at this time, and this had been true for quite some time, the Catholic Church was one of the many ways that powerful, wealthy, noble families, and this guy came from one, kind of spread out their power into as many places as possible. That is to say, usually one son or cousin in the family or more was sort of slated by the family. They didn't have the option, really, to do something else, to go into the Catholic Church and become a priest, take holy orders, hopefully become get elevated to bishop, and then archbishop, and cardinal, and even pope, if possible. So the point being that many families put family members into church service to rise to the top or as far as possible, not because of religious calling, but for political reasons, because the church was a place of power. Not the only place of power, but one of the power centers of Europe, and they wanted to be represented at high levels with their own family members. So Richelieu probably believed in his heart that he was a serious Catholic and Christian and took his job as cardinal seriously. But we can look sort of from outside and from with hindsight and say, not so much. He seems to have been much more interested in sort of secular, non-religious, non-theological, non-moral concerns than he was sort of saving souls. Now, that doesn't mean that all cardinals or all high-level church officials, clergymen, bishops, archbishops, whatever, went into it for political reasons. Some of them were truly, oriented towards, religion, and saw religion as their calling. But not this guy, and there were plenty of others sort of like him in that sense. So that helps explain, I think, why a guy like this, a political wheeler dealer of the sort of utmost caliber and utmost ruthlessness, could also be a Catholic cardinal at the same time. So Louis XIV, like his father and predecessor, also became king at a very young age as a child and couldn't rule. And his mother, Anne of Austria, decided on bringing in yet another cardinal after Richelieu was dead and gone, who I'll leave nameless just so we don't have too many names to have to keep straight. But he was brought on as regent as well, and Louis XIV was tutored and schooled in how to be a king, how to make political decisions by his cardinal who ruled France. However, there's a big difference. Whereas Louis XIII, as we've seen, was okay with and actually favored keeping his cardinal Richelieu on to rule France, even when he was old enough to sort of dismiss him, Louis XIV had no such compunctions. Louis XIV wanted to be king and to make the decisions as quickly as he possibly could. He respected the cardinal that he sort of was, schooled by, educated by, and never turned against him. They remained allies and close to each other. But when Louis came of age, which was about 16 in those days, he basically said, "I'm taking control. I'm not going to sit back and let somebody else make the decisions for me. So thank you for your service, and we'll stay in contact. In fact, he was by the time Louis became fully sort of entrenched in power. That's around the time the other cardinal passed away. It's hard for me not to say his name. So the young king, young Louis, grew up in a very unstable situation in France. Uh, the Fronde, as it was known, a civil war, broke out in the years that you see on the screen, partly because France had yet another young, child king that couldn't rule because he was a child. It's always a recipe for potential civil war and instability politically in a country when somebody that's a minor becomes king, because everybody knows that they can't rule. So it's seen by some challengers, potential challengers, usually members of the royal family or at least nobility, who say, you know what, with the king as a kid and somebody making decisions that's not the king, we can challenge that, and the public might even support us. Say, look, that's not a stable situation. You need an adult, somebody with experience, somebody that's already connected to the royal family or has royal blood in them. And so, sure enough, you get the Fronde, which was a bloody civil war, armies on both sides, and many of the leaders of the rebel side in the Fronde, working to sort of take the throne away from young Louis and his regents, were members of his own family. I mean, cousins and pretty close members of his family were fighting against him to sort of get rid of him. He and his brother and his mother, Anne of Austria, and I can't resist his name, you don't have to remember it, Cardinal Mazarin, were kind of on the run much of the time, staying in their palaces in Paris when they felt it was safe enough, but sometimes moving from town to town, city to city, staying in a lodge in the countryside, often living not like royalty, because they were sort of on the lam so much, they had to find shelter where they could. So Louis XIV grew up in kind of a precarious environment, considering especially that he was the king of France. But there was a brutal civil war going on, and he, because of the cleverness of his mother and Mazarin both, and his own sort of fortitude as he was kind of growing up, they were able to hold on and vanquish their rivals and stay in power. But it was a close run thing. It could have gone the other way. There's one event that's often talked about that Louis himself believed was, he never forgot and said was important. He never forgot it, and it influenced him, and it probably did. In the middle of the Fronde, at one point when the family was staying in one of their many palaces in Paris, the rebel forces actually broke into that palace and didn't harm the royal family, but could have, and maybe didn't, only because at the last minute they thought, wait a minute, this is a king. Maybe we've gone a little too far here. But they did end up kind of sort of checking on the family to make sure that they were there. Because they escaped so often and sort of took off into other places, the rebel forces always felt better if they at least knew where the king's whereabouts were. So that fateful night, Louis XIV was in his bedchamber, and they sort of busted in to sort of look to see if he was actually there, and he faked being asleep apparently, and they didn't harm him. He stayed, he didn't move because he faked being asleep. But this must have terrified him. He was like 9 years old, somewhere in there, and his brother as well, and he never forgot this. And the reason I bring it up is because he claimed that he so much never forgot this that he sort of from that point forward sort of made kind of a pact with himself, and said, I will, when I become king in my own right, able to rule as king in my own right, I will never allow a civil war like this to happen again. Never. I will do whatever it takes to make myself powerful enough to bring stability and law and order to the country that will not go away as long as I'm king, and hopefully ever after. So his experience in the Fronde in general, and that evening when they broke into his bedchamber and scared the daylights out of him and his family, this motivated him. So he comes to power at about 16 years old. He's famous for later saying, "I am the state," which is a boastful claim to be sure. He wasn't exactly the most humble person in the world, but what do you expect? He was the king of France. So there you go. So I am the state. And actually, the statement itself shows that in some ways he was a transitional figure and traditional king and leader, because that's a statement that can be interpreted, probably should be interpreted, as what I mentioned earlier in our earlier segment about sort of the old way of thinking about monarchies and kings, that people have a personal connection to the king. Uh, Louis is here kind of thinking of himself, the government is me. Yeah, right. That's not the modern way. That's the old way. It's changing rapidly to the modern way, which is the state isn't the person. It's sort of the abstract notion and principles of government and the structure of government and all of that. Uh, Louis understood the other as well, the way it was, the direction it was moving. That's why he's a transitional figure. He's partly thinking of the state in the old-fashioned terms of it's about me and my family. That's the government. And he's also at times, and we know this from the documents, from his own writings, from what we know about the time period, that he also could think in terms of no, the state is a more abstract concept that's sort of ongoing. It's not so much about the personality of any given king at one time or another. So the 5 ways that he made absolutism work, we've seen some of the preliminaries here, some of the foundations laid by Henry IV and Cardinal Richelieu, and he sort of took them and brought them to fruition. Number one, and this is sort of his own imprint, his own way of doing it meaning, bringing about centralized power on an absolute monarchy, royal absolutism. Number one, he maintained a godlike appearance, no matter what, or at least a larger-than-life appearance. That probably is closer to accurate. Two, he made sure he stayed in control, was involved as much as he could in decision making. Always maintained a wealthy royal treasury, imposed religious uniformity viciously, even cruelly, and maintained a standing army, which means a permanent army. They're sort of there in barracks or in their fortresses, ready to go anytime a war comes along. They're not sort of called up to duty. They're already ready, which wasn't the norm at the time. It's a pretty new idea. So let's unpack these a little bit before we move on. Uh, we'll see in the slides that follow examples of all these things, but I'm not going to kind of go back to these. You can kind of look in one or more slides or events. We'll talk about famous aspects of Louis XIV's reign, time in power. You can see one or more of these in those. Sometimes there's more than one, and we're talking about religion or the economy, etc., etc. But for now, so let's just kind of unpack these quickly, and then you can read these into what follows. He understood that, or believed, I think correctly, that at least the way government was constructed at the time, particularly in France, that the king's role was not just to make the decisions, it was to sort of be a symbol of power, one that sort of kept people kind of in awe, kept people, made them confident that, wow, this country is ruled by a dynamic individual. So he played the role of king to the hilt and apparently loved it. He always dressed to the nines as a king. He sort of had this sense of theatricality and drama, and so he played the role to the utmost. So that in a sense, he made himself, as one historian has said, into a symbol of patriotism, like a flag, and like the American flag or the French flag at the time. That people sometimes rally around the flag. I hear that saying. He's saying rally around the king. Rally around me and my personality, my persona, and he was quite good at it. Making sure he stayed in control. He was a workaholic, though he was dramatic and had a flair for the dramatic. He also worked extremely hard. he tried to get involved in or stay involved in as many aspects of government as he could. So he wasn't a guy that liked to delegate authority. He had to, because in the 17th century, government was already big enough, particularly in France, that you couldn't be the king and be involved in everything. You had to delegate, but he was involved in as much as he possibly could. Another way that he stayed in control was that when it came to the biggest decisions, he cut very few people in on them. Most of the time, there were only 4 people in the room, sometimes maybe 5, and they were the same people. Colbert, who we'll learn about, was his most trusted advisor. So one of the ways that he stayed in control and limited the possibility of somebody, uh, betraying him was to trust no more than 4 people, and he played his cards very close to his vest. You're probably thinking, and you're right, this goes back to his childhood. This was a king who was insecure as king, from the first time he can remember. He was the king all the way through the childhood, and yet he realized, he must have understood that there are people out to get him, that he was close to, not being king for much longer on many occasions. So I think this is the main explanation for why he was so concerned about control. He had trust issues. And he didn't trust, and he didn't want to trust more people than he absolutely had to or felt that he could. Always maintained a wealthy treasury. I think that's kind of like a no-brainer. Duh. Of course, you got to have money if you're a king. First, to live the lavish lifestyle, to be seen as a symbol of greatness, but also to conduct foreign policy. And war is expensive already in the 17th century. So he knew that the finances of the kingdom had to be kind of in order. Imposing religious uniformity. Keep in mind that Louis came to power about a century and a half after the beginnings of the Protestant Reformation. In England, Europe, including France, England, everywhere else, had been torn apart by conflict between Catholics and Protestants ever since. In the previous century, the 16th century, France had been racked by civil war. 8 separate civil wars in one century, extremely violent, vicious, lots of bloodshed on the battlefield, lots of massacres back and forth between Catholics and Protestants. And so he's sort of on the other side of this, now trying to figure out how do we bring sort of religious peace. And his method for doing so was imposed, forced religious uniformity, as we'll see. Meaning we're not going to have a problem between Catholics and Protestants any longer, because we're not going to have Protestants any longer. They're going to go away. They were the minority anyway, the Huguenots, as they were known. Huguenots were the French Protestants or Calvinists, but they were like 10% of the country. So he's saying we're not going to tolerate the Protestants any longer. That was an earlier solution tried to bring about religious peace, to just say, okay, let's all Catholics and Protestants both, let's kind of live in peace and fellowship. We're all Frenchmen. Let's just get along. And Louis said that isn't working, or believed it wasn't working, and said, no, we're going to solve the conflict over religion by only having one religion, the official religion, what's always been the official religion, the Catholic Church. And as harsh as it was, and it was indeed harsh, it did kind of do the job, because you don't have religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants in your country if you don't have Protestants in your country, or if you didn't have Catholics, you wouldn't have religious conflict either. But he did come down hard on this issue. But it's a crucial part of centralizing power, at least in absolute fashion, because without it, you've got a natural sort of a major division. It's sort of a major source of controversy, right? Major source of instability, because there's religious conflict is often very serious, heartfelt conflict. Maintaining a standing army, he recognized that number one, you have to have an army to keep peace at home, to keep possible rebellions from flaring up, like the Fronde in his childhood, but also that foreign policy is important as well. And there are lots of powerful countries, not just the Habsburgs in Austria, around France, and we have to be on guard at all times. And he was, of course, assertive and aggressive in foreign policy. because he wanted to increase France's size and power vis-a-vis the Habsburgs and everybody else.